Please give him a warm welcome.
Good morning, everyone. Yeah, my name is Chang-kyu Kwon, and I'm currently an assistant professor of human resource development at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. I'm so glad to be here with you this morning, and very excited to be back in Taipei. This is actually my second time visiting the city, and I'd like to start my talk today with a little funny story from my first visit. So when I first visited Taipei in 2009, our tour guide took us to a tea shop. He recommended a drink for us, and I think he mentioned that the toppings were made from frog legs or something like that. And at that time, I was like, oh, I don't know if I can do this. But looking back, I think he was just joking. And guess what? It was probably bubble tea with green tapioca pearls that look like frog eggs. Bubble tea is not one of my favorites. I should try it before I leave. Anyway, it was definitely a memorable first impression of Taipei. But today I'm here to talk about something a little more serious, something that's very close to my heart, and something that I believe is very important to our workplaces. Now, when we talk about disability employment, especially at conferences like this, the conversation often centers on hiring, representation, and the policies that make those possible. And they're all incredibly important. Opening the door matters, representation matters. But my perspective is a little different. So today I want to invite us to think about what happens after someone is hired, and actually even before that, as we still shape the kind of environment and mindset that shape how we see potential in people with disabilities. Too often, inclusion stops at access. Okay? So we ask question, how do we get more people with disabilities into the workforce? But we rarely ask, how do we maximize the full potential of people with disabilities once they are there? So today, my focus is less on policies and numbers, and more on culture and mindset, the everyday norms, beliefs, and relationships that affect whether people can truly bring their full selves to work. Because inclusion isn't just about entering the workplace, it's also about developing and thriving at work once we are inside the organization. So here's what we'll be covering. First, I'll talk about why we need to rethink workplace inclusion. Then what we mean by whole self culture and why it matters. Next, I will explore what this actually looks like in practice and how we can put it into action. And finally, I will conclude with some final reflection and key takeaways. All right, so before we begin, let me share a little bit of my story. As you can probably tell, I'm blind. I usually describe it as having only light perception. I lost my sight when I was 16 back in South Korea, where I'm originally from. So on the left side of the screen is me with my guide dog Ribbon in South Korea. And on the right side is me presenting at a professional event. So it was evening in April. I was playing soccer with my friends at school. Then the back of my head was hit really hard by a soccer ball unexpectedly. And in a sense, that kind of hit is quite common when you play sports. But that day, it hurt in a very strange way. And a few days later, I realized something was wrong with my eyes. So I went straight to the doctor, and it was retina detachment. So I had multiple surgeries at the best university hospital in the country, but unfortunately, they didn't go well. So eventually, I moved to a school with a special class for visually impaired students, and then later went on to one of the top universities in South Korea. And as I was deciding on my major, I wanted to study business. But the advice I received from people around me, including my parents, teachers, and the mentors in the blind community, was consistent. That I should not pursue business because it didn't fit my disability. So people said things like, what are you going to do with a business degree? How are you going to work in a fast-changing business environment? Why don't you just study special education or social work? And looking back, I know their feedback came from a place of care, but at that time it still felt very much discouraging because those fields simply didn't align my true interests. So I chose education as sort of a compromise because I thought it would allow me to explore both special education and adult education in different contexts, including the workplace. And during the summer of my freshman year, there was a foundation that supports visually impaired students in South Korea. And through their support, I had an opportunity to participate in a summer camp program for visually impaired students in the United States. And there, I met some American students who were also visually impaired. And that whole experience was really eye-opening for me. So when I asked them about their career goals, they all responded without hesitation. I'm going to be a lawyer. I'm going to be an accountant. I'm going to be an animal trainer. And I'm going to be a graphic designer. Well, this one came from someone who was low vision, just to be clear. What surprised me was how much open they were about their own possibilities and how the society wasn't discouraging, but rather encouraging about those pursuits. Now, I'm not saying that America is a utopia for people with disabilities. I've lived in that country for now more than 12 years, and I know bias and stereotyping still very much exist. I always tell people that there's no perfect place for people with disabilities on the planet. And some people think that America is quote-unquote a heaven for people with disabilities. And yes, it may be better than many other countries, but still it's not. I say the main difference is that at least in the United States, there's often more openness and willingness to have a conversation, when things are not working for people with disabilities. Anyway, that whole summer experience motivated me to pursue graduate education in organizational psychology and human resource development in the United States, following my passion and aspiration. And here I am today, conducting research, teaching, and consulting organizations on topics related to DEI and disability in the workplace. All right, so let's talk about the core problem. In many workplaces, people are not just hired for skills, they are hired for fit. And that is how much they align with the existing norms and values of the organization. Let me give you a quick example. I was once on a faculty hiring committee at a teaching-focused institution. We had a candidate with a strong record in both research and teaching. There was no evidence that this person was either ineffective or not committed to teaching. But because her research stood out, the committee felt that she was not the right fit for the institution. And as a result, she was not hired. But in hindsight, I think that the department might have missed the opportunity to not just gain a strong teacher, but also to grow and diversify its faculty research profile. This is what traditional work environments often do. They privilege similarity over difference. And why? Because it's more efficient and more comfortable to maintain the status quo. So here's how I break it down. Uniformity is the cultural expectation for sameness. Fitting in is how individuals respond to that expectation. And the lack of learning, reflection, and growth is what keeps the system defaulting to sameness. So if the system continues to privilege sameness, it is no surprise that people start to hide or downplay parts of who they are just to be included. So here's what the Deloitte study uncovered. They surveyed over 3,000 professionals across 10 industries, and here's what they found. 83% of LGBT individuals, 79% of Black professionals, 67% of women of color, 66% of women, 63% of Hispanic professionals, and even 45% of straight white men, which is a group that we often think of as dominant, all reported covering, meaning they hide parts of who they are. So this, to me, shows that current workplace norms and practices are not working, not just for those from historically marginalized groups, but for nearly all of us. So this isn't just a disability issue, it's a systemic inclusion issue. When the workplace is not designed to support wholeness, in other words, when people feel like they have to hide or manage parts of who they are, a few things start to happen. First, diversity becomes performative. In other words, diversity exists in name only. Second, talent is lost. When there's no real culture of inclusion in place, people who don't fit either burn out, disengage, or never even get through the door in the first place. Third, innovation is stifled. Innovation depends on diverse perspectives, lived experiences, and ways of thinking. But if everyone starts to act the same, we lose the essence of diversity. So let's pause here just for a bit before we move on. I want you all to think of a time when you couldn't fully be yourself and what that experience was like for you. Okay, so I will give you 30 seconds to think about this. All right, thank you for taking the time to reflect. Let's hold on to those thoughts as we move into defining what a whole self culture means and how such a culture may be different from one that implicitly asks us to hide parts of ourselves. So, what do we mean by having a whole self culture? Drawing upon the work of inclusion scholars like Bernardo Furman, I define it this way. A whole self culture is one where people feel safe and supported to show up fully as they are, without needing to hide or minimize parts of themselves. What's key in this definition is safety, support, and authenticity. It means that the organization actively encourages people to bring all of who they are, including their deep thoughts, values, needs, and even concerns, as vital sources of real collaboration, creativity, and innovation. This iceberg image shows the multi-layer nature of human beings. The surface level represents what's visible, so what we bring to the workplace, whereas below the water is what we often don't. As human beings, we all carry multiple intersecting identities. But some aspects of those identities, especially those that are stigmatized, are often intentionally hidden for the purpose of safety or acceptance. Examples of those would include disability, caregiving responsibilities, sexual orientation and gender identity, religious or spiritual beliefs, socioeconomic background, and so on. And what's the result? The result of not being able to bring all of who we are is emotional labor, code switching, and reduced overall well-being. Now, let's look at a real-world example of how this idea of whole self culture plays out in practice. So this case comes from a mid-sized manufacturing site in the United States, which has about 100 employees. It's part of a larger global engineering company that produces custom industrial components used in everything from aerospace and medical devices to semiconductor and energy systems. What drew my attention to this site was that it was intentionally designed around the deliberately developmental organization, or DDO culture. This means that the organization intentionally and systematically fosters employee growth and development as part of its everyday organizational practice. So let's unpack this a bit more. The concept of a DDO was developed by Robert Keegan. He's a retired Harvard faculty. And one of its central ideas is this notion of home, or what he calls a holding environment. It's a safe, trusted space where feedback, learning, and growth are normalized, and where becoming better together is the shared goal of the organization. To become the best versions of themselves, people are encouraged to actively seek out help, ask questions, and challenge each other's assumptions and perspectives, all in service of personal and organizational growth. Here in a DDO, vulnerability is not seen as a weakness. Rather, it's seen as a necessary condition for development. This is especially important when we talk about inclusion because it's hard to be your full self in a place where seeking help is seen as unprofessional, or challenging institutional assumptions is seen as either unproductive or even destructive. So what does this all mean for people with disabilities? When organizations truly cultivate a whole self culture, we start to see some powerful benefits. Here are three that I want to highlight from my case research. First, people develop clear self boundaries. In a whole self culture, people with disabilities can be more open about what they can and cannot do without fear of judgment or penalty. This isn't just about disclosing a disability. It's about naming personal boundaries and working within them. That clarity can reduce the pressure to overperform or mask limitations, which is common in traditional work environments. Second, there's greater confidence in asking for what's needed. When people feel safe to be honest about their limits, they're more empowered to ask for the support they need. Interestingly, many of the supports offered to people with disabilities in this organization were not provided under the name of quote-unquote accommodations. There was nothing special about disability support here because support was already embedded in the system. And third, the workplace becomes safer and smarter for everyone. When people are encouraged to bring their full selves, new ways of thinking are encouraged. And this not only improves the experience of employees with disabilities, but also raises the bar for the entire organization. In this manufacturing and high-risk context, that culture directly reduced injuries and improved overall organizational outcomes. So, as part of my research, I interviewed several employees with disabilities at this case organization. And what I'm going to share now are their own words. which powerfully illustrate what a whole self culture looks like in practice. So let's look at the first benefit in more detail. Here's the quote. I try to make people aware of what I can and can't do. Sometimes we have tasks that require bending down or lifting something, and I'll let them know, hey, I can't do that part. No one complains, they just step in. This quote illustrates how this person is clear about the boundaries of his ability. Instead of pushing through or hiding his limitations, he can just say, hey, I can't do that part, knowing that someone will help. From this individual's perspective, this kind of clarity significantly reduces stress and supports well-being. As boundaries become clear and respected, the next benefit is that people feel safer in speaking up about their needs. Here's another quote. Here, I feel more comfortable telling people when I'm not feeling well. Outside this organization, I don't talk much about my condition. People wouldn't really understand what I go through. But here, I can share it. In many organizations, people with disabilities, and especially those with less visible disabilities, tend to stay silent either because they've been misunderstood in the past or because they fear being seen as less capable. But in this organization, this person feels safe enough to say when she's not feeling well. That ability to be open not only reduces emotional burden, but also helps people get the support they need. The third benefit is that the workplace becomes safer and smarter for everyone. If I ever have doubts about whether something is safe, I can stop and speak up, and no one retaliates. Someone actually listens and investigates. In my old job, they would say, just do it. And if you weren't fast enough, you would get pushed out. In this quote, this person highlights how the organization genuinely welcomes questions and concerns. When someone raises a safety issue as feedback, they're taken seriously, which is a sharp contrast to his experience in a previous job. When people feel safe to speak up, when people are empowered to speak up, especially in high-risk environments like this, it benefits both individuals and the organization in the long run. Specifically, it reduces employee injury rates and can potentially lead to increased morale, retention, and productivity. So now that we've explored some key benefits of a whole self culture, and particularly for people with disabilities, let's start thinking about how we can put this into action, okay? So here are my 5 recommendations. First is to recognize inclusion as an adaptive challenge. One of the misconceptions about inclusion is that there's a set of fixed solutions in place. So if you do this, this, and that, you're going to achieve inclusion. Well, that's a typical checklist mentality. Inclusion doesn't work that way. Inclusion is not a technical challenge that can be resolved through easy, quick, known solutions. Also, inclusion is not an end goal. It's a process that requires ongoing reflection and adaptation of how we bring ourselves to work, as well as how we relate to others. So here I've got an image of a flowing river to show you the continuous and adaptive nature of the work of inclusion. The river keeps moving and flows constantly, and even if there's a big rock in the way, it adjusts its flow and direction to adapt. Same with inclusion. Inclusion is not about removing every obstacle all at once. Rather, it's about building the collective capacity to move with and through them together. Second is to shift our leadership mindset from an expert model to a lifelong learning model. Another common misconception about inclusion is that in order to be inclusive, you must know in advance all aspects of diversity and how to deal with them in advance. Well, as you can imagine, that's virtually impossible. Even speaking for myself, I may be a little bit more knowledgeable about disability than others, but that doesn't mean that I know everything about, let's say, the experiences of those with different racial backgrounds or sexual orientations. Certainly, having some baseline knowledge helps. I'm not undermining the importance of that. But I believe that the criteria of what it means to lead inclusively must shift towards how we engage in situations that are often ambiguous and emotionally charged, and more importantly, how we can continually grow as inclusive leaders through those experiences. So this image where a blind person and a deaf person are having difficulty communicating illustrates just how complex it can be to fully understand the experiences of others, even within the same disability community. There's just a variety of different types and degrees of disability, which makes it challenging for any one of us to be an expert on everything. So instead of trying to be an expert on diversity from a knowledge standpoint, what's really needed is a willingness to connect with others and learn from them in ways that expand our thinking. Once we shifted ourselves to have a learning mindset, then what is needed is to intentionally seek out perspectives, diverse perspectives, and new ways of making meaning. Pay attention to the word intentionally here, because in order to be a truly inclusive leader, you must actively seek out perspectives that may at times even contradict your own perspectives. And the best way to learn from diverse perspectives is to invite and engage directly with those who have lived experiences. This also reminds us about what Annika shared with us yesterday about the global disability rights movement. Nothing about us without us. This quote is from the Minister of Employment and Labor in South Korea, where the government has recently been trying to reduce industrial death. What's interesting here is their leadership approach. So they're trying to open up direct communication with the people on the ground. So those with lived experience or those who are closest to it. So the idea is simple but powerful. Solutions should come from those who know the problems best. Next is creating a psychologically safe environment. This is really, really important because diverse ideas and perspectives can only be shared authentically when people feel safe to speak up without fear of judgment or punishment. This is what we mean by psychological safety. I brought this image to illustrate the concept of psychological safety. In a safe work environment, cross-power feedback is more likely to occur. This means that someone in a lower hierarchy or from a marginalized group can be more vocal about their work or their personal experiences in the organization, which then serves as an opportunity to improve the organization as a whole, including matters related to diversity, equity, and inclusion. This also connects back to what Suzanne shared with us yesterday about the importance of workplace climate and the role of supervisors, because even if there's a law that requires the provision of accommodations, people with disabilities may be hesitant to request one if they feel relationally and culturally unsafe to do so. So as leaders, our job is to think about how we can create this kind of safe environment for continuous feedback, learning, and growth, which I'm going to be talking a little bit more in my final recommendation on the next slide. So my final action item, the action item I suggest, is to model a whole self culture ourselves. This means showing openness to new perspectives, humility in recognizing that our own perspectives may be limited, and vulnerability in sharing parts of ourselves that may not be perfect. When we model these kinds of qualities, we create a safe relational space in which our employees feel comfortable doing the same. I want to share this quote from Brené Brown because I think it really captures well the heart of what it means to lead with the whole self culture. So Brené Brown said, "The courage to be vulnerable is not about winning or losing. It's about the courage to show up when you can't predict or control the outcome." This kind of vulnerability, in other words, showing up even when there's uncertainty, is at the core of inclusion. For many people, especially those with disabilities or other marginalized identities, simply being seen and heard at work requires a lot of courage. And as leaders, it also requires us to show that same courage to help others bring their authentic selves. This may be daunting for us, equally daunting for us, because we also have to let go of our desire to always be right and to control the processes and outcomes of inclusion when in fact we may not always have the immediate answers. But this sense of togetherness is how we move from performative inclusion to meaningful and co-creative culture change. Okay, so let's take a pause for a moment and take some time to reflect on the 5 commitments we just explored. So which one resonates to you the most, feels most relevant to you in your leadership or work context right now, and why? And consider how this commitment could support your efforts to foster inclusion, whether related to disability or any other dimension of human difference. So I know you've been listening a lot since yesterday, so I'm going to have you talk. It's a talking time. So let's stretch a little bit, okay? And turn to the person next to you. Make a pair to discuss this, okay? I'm going to give you 4 minutes for this. So 2 minutes per person, okay? And then I'm going to have a few folks share back with the whole group. So just wanted to let you know about this. You can switch the turn now. 2 minutes left. Now it's done, right? All right, thanks for the live discussion. Thank you. All right, all right. So I'd like to invite, oh wow. You guys like talking. I didn't know that. Well, thank you again. And so I would like to invite a couple of you to share what you guys discussed with the person next to you. So any volunteer?
哎，这样可以吗？可以。好，教授好。那因为我们自己是 NGO 组织，也是身心障碍者团体，然后刚才的那些观念，其实我们都蛮喜欢的，然后也希望在组织里面去实践这个东西。那我待的这个单位，目前应该是我在职场里面待过最开放的一个。可是其实还是会碰到一些难点，譬如说我们在讲自己遇到的一些状况的时候，可能会跟别人的需求有冲突。或者是说有一些障碍者，他可能在适应的时候，我这样讲可能有点不太好，但是台湾的环境其实是有点先天不良和后天失调，所以有一些障碍者他在融入社会的时候，前面可能就有遇到一些问题，所以他后来在跟大家沟通的时候，就是他的状况可能会跟一般的想象他有一些落差，然后会让我们觉得有点不知道怎么把他拉上来。那这种冲突跟尴尬的状况，就是我很好奇说怎么样在全人的文化里面去达到一个平衡。谢谢。
Was that a question to me? So, sorry, I missed the first part of your comment. Briefly, one more time, yeah.
好，那其实我们刚有讨论啦，那只是讨论的时候就跑出新问题。那比较多的问题是说，大家都透露了自己的脆弱或者是需求，但是我们的需求可能跟别人会有一些冲突之类的，因为你一个组织要我们要营运下去，它可能比如说要有募款的压力啊、KPI 的压力等等，那怎么在这个需求里面跟我们要达到的目标去抓一个平衡？对，谢谢。
Right. So I can share my thoughts definitely, but in after the session perhaps if you talk to me. But I think if I can briefly just respond to your question, I think that's a really valid point in terms of, we are always limited in terms of resources and people have different needs. So to me, it's almost like a paradigm shift in terms of what we as an organization prioritizes, right? So this DDO culture really centers learning over performance, right? So, and the theory says, if we focus on learning and helping each other grow, and that leads to performance in some way, right? And so it's almost to me a call for paradigm shift. Yeah, so we can have a further conversation. Thanks for the thoughtful question and the discussion. I'd like to invite a couple more to share.
Hi, over here. I'd like to share our discussion and also my own experience. The point I shared was before I knew about DEI, I tried to hide away from the fact that I am an introvert, but I'm working right now as a professor and been a professor for a long time. And before being a professor, I was actually a consultant. And as a consultant and a professor, people expect you not to be an introvert. So naturally, before I knew about the idea of DEI, I actually tried to hide the fact that I'm an introvert and the fact that naturally I usually do not like to serve as the attention of the center of attention, and I actually shy away from interaction when I can. But that's not to be expected in my role as a consultant and a professor. And so I was just sharing with my colleague Jen here, who is an extrovert, and she actually couldn't understand how come I am an introvert, because it never showed up to her that all these characteristics I just described myself, because she always saw me as someone who is very expressive and actually can warm up a table, okay, when I'm in it. Actually, she put me in strategically in a table with our foreign guests, so that there's somebody who can actually be a host, to a kind host to everybody, not knowing that that's actually a huge, what we call emotional labor to someone who is an introvert. And in the past, I never talked about this in work, but now that the idea of DEI is now more open to everyone, I have already reflected myself and become more comfortable talking about this. And I started talking about this in my class when I taught DEI. So some of my students here heard about it. And right now I'm also sharing with my colleague that the fact that my characteristic as an introvert actually in a lot of the tasks that my colleagues so naturally assigned to me actually is a huge burden in terms of emotional labor for me.
Right, yeah, thanks for sharing. Yeah, that's right. It's a right example of, how much it could be a, sort of emotional labor for individual who's different from the very norm of the organization, right? And so thanks for sharing. Well, I want to move on for the sake of time. All right, is this the right slide? Yep. So, so to conclude, I want to share key final takeaways. So inclusion isn't just about who we include, but how we include them. Embracing a whole self culture means shifting from a mindset of belonging if to belonging as. And last but not least, there's nothing separate or special about disability inclusion. When we create a workplace that works for everyone, it works for people with disabilities too. So I want to leave you with this powerful reflection from one of my research participants. It didn't feel like just a workplace. It felt like a family. Even though I was different, they accepted me for who I am. It wasn't about how I looked or how smart I was. They saw the real me, and that was really cool. This is what leading with the whole self culture truly feels like. In a whole self culture, people with disabilities are no longer passive recipients of extra support. They are co-creators of adaptive and inclusive systems. Thank you for listening.
Thank you.
This is the references. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much to Professor Kwon. Thank you for your inspiring speech and also the chance for our participants